The third mistake that we as DIYers make when wiring light switches is using backstabs. I was literally just at Home Depot this morning and I talked to the woman who was in charge of the electrical department, and she told me that people are always asking her for the kinds of light switches and outlets where you can just push those wires in the back. That's called backstabbing, and here's why I recommend not using that. I thought it might be kind of cool to show you how the inside of a light switch actually works, and this kind of helps to set the stage for why we want to wire it a certain way. So you can see there's a spring in the middle, and when we switch it, if you look on this side up here, you can see the end of the arm right now, the light switch is on and there's contact happening, but as I lift and switch that to the off position, it's going to push that arm away from the other side. And so there is no circuit being closed right now, and therefore the switch is off. On and off. If we take this apart a little bit, and by the way, I think it's pretty clever, there are these two rubber posts right here, one here and one here, and that's what gives it that nice kind of solid thump as it goes on and off, which is pretty cool. I'll take this spring out and show you on the inside. You can actually just pop this piece out altogether. This is our push-in connector right here. So this one little arm right here is all that's holding it in. Now on the bright side, it does push it against this wall, which is a good thing, but as I insert a wire into here, you can watch how this happens. There we go, and push that in, and then it holds it up against that wall. But what happens over time is this little arm loses its tension, especially as the vibrations occur over time, and especially if it gets moved or wriggled around and that kind of thing. If that loses its tension, then it's not going to make pure and proper contact, unfortunately. These backstabs are a really common reason for electricians to get calls because everything looks like it's working, but for some reason it's just not. Or worse, there's a fire, there's a short, or some other issue. You can see right here it says push-in terminals not for reuse. That's pretty important. You're allowed to use these once, and that makes it even more perplexing as to why these would get used. This begs the question, if it's a one-time thing, why even bother? So if I want to make any alteration or change, I literally have to cut them free, and then once I do that, I've got these little metal studs hanging out that are connected to the electricity, which means that that is an increased possibility of something in the box touching that and then getting a short, or worse, a fire. Now I have to mention that with all that being said, it is totally up to code to use the push-in connectors on the back. You can use those backstabbing connections and everything can be up to NEC, no problem. The thing is that there are almost always better options. A lot of the electricians I speak with tell me that they don't approve of it and they wouldn't use it, but a lot of people say, well, why is it there if it's not actually the best way to do it? And that's because it's just one of many options. Now when I speak with these electricians, most of them recommend either side wiring or back wiring. We're going to talk more about side wiring in just a second, and back wiring we're going to cover in a little more depth at the end of this video. The second mistake that we as DIYers make when wiring light switches is putting our shepherd's hook in the wrong direction. You've most likely seen side wiring before. It's when you create a little hook in your copper wire and then you wrap it around the stud of the screw and tighten down that screw on the side of your light switch. Now with side wiring, bending the hook counterclockwise makes it a lot easier for the hook to actually pop free of the screw as you tighten it. Check this out. This one I've got it going the wrong direction, so the hook opening is on the left side because I've bent it counterclockwise, and as I tighten this down, it'll reach a certain point and pop, it just pops right out. And then whether you know it or not at the time, that becomes a total fire hazard inside your electrical box. Clockwise bending, on the other hand, actually encourages a tighter hook, and as you tighten it, it should increase the contact with the metal plate underneath. You may have seen this little hook-shaped piece of plastic, and this is included on most modern light switches. This is known as a pressure lug or a bending stud, and it can be placed to the left or the right, or even on both sides. These serve a couple of different purposes. You can actually use these to tighten down the hook once you've wrapped it around the screw. And if you have your wire cut just right, it actually makes it really easy to do and really helps out. To me, it makes sense seeing these on the right side where you can use it to close that hook a little bit better. I'm not quite sure why they have them on the left side other than maybe to help guide the wire into the right place so it doesn't skip out, and maybe it acts like as a little hook to hold things in place, but it doesn't seem to serve much of a purpose other than that. And why not put it on the right side where it's a little more useful? So if you've got some insight into that, I'd love to learn more about that, and please leave some comments in that comment section below to help us out with that. Because our goal is to have as much contact between the copper wire and the metal of the switch as possible, you can use that pressure lug to close that hook up, and if there is no pressure lug or if that just isn't working, you can also use some needle nose pliers like this to tighten that down. With that, as you tighten that screw, you're going to have excellent contact and that thing isn't going anywhere. Keep in mind you don't have to torque this thing down like there's no tomorrow. You really just need to get it snug, and if you do that and everything's wrapped up properly, it's not going to go anywhere. For the ground screws, you'll often see a small hole near the screw, sometimes a couple of them. Now this allows you to put the end of the wire into that hole and then wrap the wire around the screw's stud. Referring to the electrician that wired my house again, he actually found a kind of creative way to do this differently as well. I think anything to make it fast, basically. You can see the lip on the left, which is meant to hold the left side of the wire in place and provide additional contact. Well, he decided to just go the opposite direction and skip that altogether. That said, if you look at how this is working, the end of the wire is actually anchored into the hole, so he still had to wrap the wire clockwise, so it will tighten the wire to the terminal as the screw is fastened. It's a different way to do it, but I think it actually works in this case. Now again, at the end of this video, I'll show you an option that I found that works really well and helps you to avoid even those hooks on the ground screw. I hope this thing becomes more and more common, but we'll check that out in just a minute. If you're a DIYer and want to wear loud and proud, wear shirts like this and many others that I have in my store, I've got a link in the description below that you can check out to buy yourself a shirt or for someone that you love. Or kind of like, works too, whatever. The last mistake that we as DIYers make when wiring light switches is stripping the improper amount of insulation on our wires. Just like with outlets, if we strip too much or too little wire, we're going to end up with problems. Too little stripped means that we run the risk of tightening the screw down onto the insulated portion rather than the bare metal. And that creates less contact and in some case no contact with the wire itself. Obviously not a good thing. Now if you have too much exposed wire, that means that it could possibly hang out the bottom and again run the risk of making contact with other wires inside the box. This kind of puts us in the same situation that we showed earlier where you snip off those push-in connectors and you've got that metal sticking out the back. Not a good thing, and we want to avoid that if at all possible. Ideally, we want it just long enough to contact the closing lug, but not stick out past it. Most switches and outlets or receptacles have what's called a stripping gauge, but they're often specifically meant for the stab-in connectors. So you want to check the writing next to it to make sure that it's for the stab-in versus side wiring. And some wire strippers actually include a stop block so you can set just the right amount each time. Now I've got some great news. I've got a tip here for you that will help you to avoid pretty much all of the things that we just talked about. You can now buy light switches that have what's called back wiring. These have been available for a while, but I'm starting to see some that have back wiring not only for your line and your load wires, but also for your ground wires as well. That means no shepherd's hooks at all, and you can basically use your strip gauge to get the exact right amount of insulation removed, drop each one in, tighten 3 screws, and you're good to go. Back wiring, unlike what we see with backstabbing, is the process where you strip a little wire and you leave your copper wire perfectly straight and then you feed it into an area that clamps down on it. Those clamps actually produce pressure on both the front and the back, and they have a ton of contact of that metal because all of your wire is actually touching the back plate as well as the clamp, and so it gets excellent conductivity and excellent contact. Now one of the cool things I love that I'm starting to see that I mentioned earlier is that there are ways to actually do back wiring with your ground screw. If you take a look at this piece right here, if you read through the instructions, you can actually use this little pocket down here underneath the ground screw. So you just push your wire down into there, tighten your ground screw. It's got a little notch or a little slot for that wire to stay on, and then that way you don't have to bend the wire at all. It's just push in, tighten, and you're good to go. Another thing you'll find on certain commercial grade light switches is that they have the traditional clamp plate on their ground switches as well. So they look just like the load and line. You can feed it in there and then tighten down your screw and you get great connectivity and it holds in there really strongly. Now a lot of what I learned comes from you, the viewer, when you leave those helpful comments in the comments section below. So feel free to share with us any tips that you have for wiring light switches and let's see if we can help each other out. My name is Nils with Learn to DIY. Thanks for watching.